I'm pleased to say that joining us now is Senator Tammy Baldwin, who has been, among many other accomplishments, one of the leading figures in the cause for financial reform and Wall Street reform. So, Senator Baldwin, thanks so much for coming on the program.
It's a pleasure, Richard. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, there were several things I wanted to talk to you about today, and we'll try to use your time as effectively as possible, but there are a number of initiatives you're taking that are of great interest to us and to me personally, given my own background in writing about financial reform. And the first of those is the revolving door.
Yes.
Yeah, I sometimes call it the Acela government, the government that commutes between Washington and Lower Manhattan. And so kind of runs our economy that way. And it's been an enormous problem for a long time. We've seen a lot of Goldman Sachs and other financial institutions even pay bonuses for people to go into government service or to take high government positions. We see the rotation between government and Wall Street, and we see that it hasn't really worked out all that well for the American people. So what are your thoughts on that?
Got that right.
Yeah, and what we can do about it.
Yeah, so the legislation that I've introduced bans these golden parachutes for government service, first and foremost, because it's shocking when you hear about this, and this is 6 and sometimes 7-figure golden parachutes. Optically it's bad, and in reality, it's horrendous. So it bans that, and then, in terms of that revolving door, it extends to 2 years, the period of time between when you can have been an overseer, a regulator, and go back to the very same folks that you were overseeing as a public servant. These are just sort of no-brainers to me. These are sort of basic rules, but they're not being adhered to, and we've got to, unfortunately, pass a bill in order to make it happen.
Yeah, it seems to me it's a no-brainer too, and to me it gets to a deeper problem, which is how can you adequately, which sometimes means aggressively, regulate the people you hang out with every day, the people you work with, the people you have lunch with and cocktails with and dinner with. How can you combine those two? It seems you have to create some distance somehow, and your bill would be a step in that direction.
When you are in public service, you are serving the people of the United States, people who need protectors from fraud, from carelessness, from all sorts of things. And so you have to be siding with the taxpayer, with the American people when you're in one of these jobs, not your old buddies, as you just suggest, or people that you hope will be your future buddies.
Well, that's a great point, because then your motivation may not always be clear even to yourself, right?
Right. I mean, I have heard accounts of people coming into major financial institutions for purposes of an audit or a review who were described more as auditioning for their next job.
Right.
And that's not what the American people need.
Right. No, I couldn't agree with you more. And so I think that your bill is an enormous step in the right direction. I would also bring up a related issue, more having to do with hedge funds and less with regulation and revolving door. I come from Utica, New York, originally.
Oh, yes.
And Utica is part of the once industrial United States, or the Rust Belt, which has been decimated. Now we're seeing a process where hedge fund investors and others are buying up ownership, sometimes in the company, a company town's only company, and are decimating that town by closing that industry down or that company down. And my understanding is that you're looking at addressing this sort of what we sometimes call vulture fund activity. So
yes.
I'd love to hear more about what you're doing in that area.
You come from Utica. I represent Wisconsin, and we have a community called Brokaw.
Mm-hmm.
Brokaw is just a little bit north of Wausau, Wisconsin. And I think you could describe it also as a company town. Wausau Papers had a mill there that existed for over 100 years. Just before I was elected to the United States Senate, an activist hedge fund, more or less, got huge influence over the board at Wausau Papers, over the executives at Wausau Papers. I will tell you, Wausau Papers, despite the fact that they're named after Wausau, Wisconsin, no longer has an operating mill in Wisconsin. A couple were sold. In Brokaw, they closed it. I will say emphatically, it was not unprofitable when it was closed. So 100 years, generations of workers. People would say, I worked there, my father did, my grandfather did. What the bill would do, first of all, we can't take back what happened at Brokaw. So, but we can do everything we can as a people to make sure this doesn't happen all across the country in other instances. And what it does is create greater transparency so that we can understand what activist hedge funds are up to. So important because we're talking about some Depression-era rules that don't recognize that we can do real-time reporting practically. So it changes some timelines so we know faster when hedge funds are gaining much more sizable shares of interest in a company that's publicly traded, 5% or above. Disclosure of wolf packs. And what do I mean by the term wolf packs? I mean different activists working in concert with each other. There's a lot of effort to keep each ownership under 5% and then secretly work together, but have a very sizable interest in the company.
And just so our listeners know, when we say activists in this context, and we're talking with Senator Tammy Baldwin, we're not talking about political activists,
That's
right? We're
very
talking about
true.
activist investors who want to take over control of a company.
Exactly. And we've seen more and more plots hatched in recent years. Those who are following it have seen it go from virtual no activity on the part of activist investors to dozens of plots, if you will, a year. Now, the third part of the Brokaw Act is the requirement that you disclose if you have a negative position in the company. In other words, if you're betting on it to lose. And that was something that was so heartbreaking to me in our Great Recession, was to see people fearing failure and saying, well, let's at least make some money off of it.
Right. And sometimes then engineering that failure.
There's the incentive to do that if you take those positions.
See, this is such an important thing for us to be addressing, and that's why I'm glad you're doing it, because this also speaks to what people sometimes call the financialization of our economy. The idea that a company like Wausau, when these investors come in, they're no longer managing it for the long-term financial health even of that company, and it's much less its employees or the community. They are pillaging it basically for short-term gain.
Right, and it's been known as short-termism. It's also been known as quarterly capitalism. But for those of us who represent manufacturing states, manufacturing areas, this is deeply disturbing because the long-term interests and health of these companies and the workers there require investment. And if you're a profitable company, it makes sense to update your equipment, get the latest equipment, train your workforce to advanced manufacturing techniques, invest in R&D so you have the next thing, and that it will keep your company profitable for years. Give your employees raises if they're doing well. And the temptation to engage in stock buybacks, which is just going through the roof these days, and engaging in payout of dividends, there's just too much focus on, extracting that short-term profit and not making the investments that make these companies century-old companies like I was describing.
Absolutely. So I think that's wonderful work. I'm glad you're doing it. And lastly, in about the minute we have left, my understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong, that we're also looking at the issue of hedge funders and others paying the same tax rates as everyone else.
Isn't that just basic sense? Yes, indeed.
You'd think,
so
right?
I am proud to carry the bill that closes the carried interest loophole, which is a fancy way of saying it ends the preferential tax treatment that hedge fund managers get. They pay lower interest rates than many nurses and teachers and truck drivers. And I feel as though you're just talking about the financialization of our society. We treat people who work hard for a living differently than we treat wealth. We should treat work with greater dignity than we do. And this is just a tax break for those who are very privileged, very powerful, and very wealthy, and it ought not to be.
I couldn't agree with you more. Well, Senator Tammy Baldwin, thanks so much for working on these issues and fighting for them, and thanks for coming on our program.
Thank you so much, Richard. I really appreciate it.